Hey you all, welcome to the colors of the Cheerful Box. So in this box, of course, we're going to use fun Christmassy colors, and I always use the Master Elites from the Sugar Art. If you don't have Master Elites, no problem, just use whatever color you have. But this is the red rose. We are going to use piping and flooding consistency. And one little tip that I have is I always put my piping in a smaller bag and the flooding in a bigger bag. That way I can keep track of which is which. I use bags from Cheerful Cutters. I think they're excellent quality bags. So again, red rose, piping and flooding. Next, we're going to use emerald green, Master Elites. We are going to use piping and flooding. Again, little bag for piping, big bag for flooding. Next, we're going to use Sunshine by Master Elites. We're going to use piping and flooding. Next, we are going to use white. That's easy enough, right? White, piping, and flooding. Next, we are going to use True Brown Master Elites. You can tell I have used this a lot. I love this color brown because it really is a true brown, and you can make so many different shades by just adding a little bit more. So if you just add a little bit to your icing, you're going to get this light brown shade. This is the true brown. So we're going to use a piping and a flooding. Then if you add some additional powder, you are going to get a darker shade. So piping and flooding of the lighter brown and piping and flooding of the darker brown. You can all do it all using the true brown. We are also going to use black, but I have not mixed that yet. I don't like to mix my black until right before I'm going to use it because sometimes the color will separate. But again, I'm going to use Master Elite black. When you're making your black icing, a little tip is you can make it ahead of time. I'll usually make it the day before. I'll let it sit and the color will develop over time. So let's get right into the fun. Aren't these gorgeous colors? Oh, I love it. I love Christmas cookies. So let's start. Oh, don't forget, you can use code Cheerful Baker at the Sugar Art to save 15%. You don't have to use the Sugar Art colors. You can use whatever colors you like. That's just what I like to use. Let's get started. So let's make this adorable Christmas tree together. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to grab your piping bag. We're just going to outline where the star would be. Now you'll notice when I'm doing my piping, I'm not dragging my icing along the cookie. I actually touch the cookie to get a dot of icing to stick, and then I lift my bag up and I drop the rest of the icing onto the cookie. That way you have a little bit more of a rounded line and your icing will not fall over the edge. Now, I'm just looking at the clip art to decide how I want to decorate this cookie. You could do it like this, or if you're more comfortable, you could just fill the whole cookie in with green and then even put sprinkles on top of it. But I want my cookie to look like it has some dimension. So I'm sort of making some little U's or smiley faces with my piping icing. Now I'm going to take my green flooding icing and I am going to fill in the bottom part of my tree. You'll notice that I'm pushing the icing into the little smiley faces or U's. Also, you do not want to have any cookie showing when you do this. You want to make sure that when you fill it with icing that it's good and full. That makes it easier. You don't really want to have to spread your icing out. Now I'm just going to use my scribe tool and I'm going to pull the icing into the areas that I want it to go. And I'm kind of pushing it down into the icing where there are any little peaks. If you push on those real gently, the icing will go down. Now, I let this cookie dry for about probably an hour because I don't want to mess up that bottom section. And then I'm taking my piping icing, and you'll notice I'm starting in between the U's or the smiley faces at the bottom of the tree, and I'm just going up, and I'm actually going into that next section because it'll be covered with icing. Now, after I do this, I can go ahead and start filling that next section with green flooding icing, just like I did the first section. Now, because I let this dry a little bit before I put those lines on top, you'll notice that you can see a difference between the two sections of the tree. And I like it when it looks like that. So we're just going to keep doing the same thing. We're going to flood this section, then we're going to allow it to dry about an hour, and then you are going to do the lines on top. Now, while I do this cookie, during the dry time, I'm working on other cookies. So you're not just sitting there, but you could also be watching your favorite Netflix show. But it is important to have dry time in between the steps. So here again, I'm taking my piping icing and I'm doing the same thing that I did on the bottom portion of the tree. And then I can start doing the top portion. Now, while I'm waiting for that top section of the tree to dry, I can go ahead and take my darker brown piping icing and go around the bottom of my tree. Now, once I do it with the piping icing, I can go ahead and fill it in with the flood icing because that bottom of the tree has been drying now for a while, and those two areas will not just sort of meld together. I want them to look like they're two separate areas. I'm going to take my scribe and I'm just going to wiggle the icing around, and then our trunk is finished. So the top part of my tree has crusted over, and I can now repeat the same steps that I did on the other sections, using the piping icing to create the lines. Now I'm going to take my scribe tool and I'm going to put it parallel to the cookie. And I'm just going to clean up the area where I'm going to put my icing for the star. So you'll see I'm using my piping icing to go around the edge of the star, and then I'm going to fill it in with the flood. The reason I cleaned it up is because I don't want there to be any lumps underneath the icing that I use for the star. So I put a little bit of piping icing down before I flooded it, and then I'm putting the flood on top because that helps with preventing craters. Now this cookie is done. Now let's do our ornament cookie. And with this cookie, we're going to create a wet on wet design. And those are fun cookies to make. And they're actually time-saving cookies because you don't have to have all the dry time that you did like in the first cookie that we created. So I'm taking my red piping icing and I'm just going to go along the edge of my cookie. Next, I'm going to take my red flood and I'm going to fill it in. And you'll notice when I flood the cookies, I go from the edge of the cookie in to the center. And the next step we're going to do while the red icing is still wet. So you do not want to decorate cookies underneath of a ceiling fan because it'll dry your icing too quickly. These wet on wet designs, it's important that the bottom layer is still wet when you put the design on top. So I filled this with the red flooding icing, and I'm just using my scribe to get the icing all over the cookie and get around to the edges. And next, I'm going to wiggle it a little bit. That kind of helps to settle the icing. And if you have a little peak, you can just push down on it very gently with your scribe and it'll sink in. Next, I'm going to take my white flood icing. If I use my piping icing, it would be too thick and it would not sink down. So the tip to my flood icing, I cut very, very small. And I'm just going down with lines in kind of a haphazard manner. And because the red icing is still wet, the white icing is just going to sink right in. Now, if you are a little bit slower at flooding, what you can do is after your red has dried, you can use your piping icing, not your flooding, but your piping to do the lines on top. So when it's wet on wet, you want to use flooding and flooding. Flooding red with flooding white on top. If you're doing the design on top of the red after the red has already dried, you always want to use the piping icing because it's a little bit thicker and it will give you a cleaner look. So I'm just cleaning up around the edges. And then I'm going to take that same white flood and I'm just going to create little dots. And when I do this, my tip is actually touching the red, but barely touching it. If you do it above the red and you try and drop it down, it'll look real messy. But if your white tip is just barely touching the red and you squeeze out a little dot, it will automatically stick and it will look neater and you will have a more rounded dot. Now I'm going to let this cookie dry for about 15 minutes till it really crusts over. Then I'm going to take my yellow piping. I'm going to go around the edges of the top, and then I'm going to fill it in with my flooding icing. Don't forget to do the little hangy thing at the top. You want to do that with your piping icing as well. Now, once we fill in that yellow, this cookie will be done. Now it's time to grab that stencil because we are going to use it with this cookie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my red piping icing and I'm just going to go around the bottom of my chimney. And you want to go down further than where the snow starts. So I'm just creating a rectangle, and then I'm going to fill this with red flood, and I'm actually going to let this dry overnight. If you don't let it dry overnight, when you use the stencil, it'll just crush the icing. If you don't want to use the stencil with royal icing, you can just allow this cookie to dry for about an hour or so, and then you can use the stencil and an airbrush machine. But if you don't have an airbrush and you want to do what we're going to show right here, you want to make sure that this layer is really, really dry. So I allowed mine to dry overnight. Now I'm just going to sit my stencil right on top of my cookie because it's good and dry. It's dried overnight. You are going to use your thick piping icing, and you're going to use a scraper. You could use a knife. You could use a little tool like this if you have one. You can use an icing scraper, and you're just going to scrape that icing, and it's thick icing again, over top of the stencil. How you'll know when you've put enough is whenever the icing has filled the little areas, the brick areas, but you've scraped it off so that you can see the areas in between the brick. So that is finished. You could also have a different effect by using white icing underneath and scraping red over top of it. But I like the way that this looks. It's not a real in-your-face design, but it looks really cool, and people are always like, how did you make that look like brick? Now we're going to take our white piping icing. We're going to go around the base, and then as soon as we have outlined it, we're going to use that same piping icing to fill this in. We want it nice and thick because this is snow. Then you're going to sit this cookie aside to dry for, I don't know, about 15 minutes or so before you start with the red on top. Now I got a little bit in that section on top, so I just used that little tool to clean it off. Now we're going to go around with our piping icing, just like we did on that bottom part. And then we're going to fill it in with our flood. And you want this to be really good and filled because you want this part to kind of stick up a little bit higher than the part underneath because this is the top of the chimney. Now you're going to let this dry till it crusts over, maybe about 30 minutes or so. Actually, I would probably let this dry an hour because we're going to put some thick icing on top of it. We don't want it to just sink right down in the red. We want it to actually be on top. So now you're going to take your white piping icing and you're just going to do kind of a haphazard design on top to look like snow. And just like you did the base, you're going to fill it in using that piping icing because you want it to be really good and thick. So that cookie is finished. So next we're going to do the star of the show, Santa Claus. So you are going to use the red marker that came in your box. And you are going to just draw where the top or the bottom of his hat is and where the little ball of his hat would be. And I'm doing this just by looking at the clip art. Next, you're going to draw where his face is, and you'll notice that I go down about as far as his little mitten hands are. That kind of gives you a good guide. And you're not going all the way to the edge of the cookie because you want to leave room for his beard. Next, you're just going to use your red piping icing, and you are going to outline where all of the red is on his suit. You're just not going to fill in the areas that are going to be white. So I'm filling in the hat, but I'm not going to fill the little, or I'm not going to pipe the little area that's going to be the ball because that's going to be white. So once you've used your red piping icing to pipe around the areas that you can see here in the video, you're going to use your red flood icing and you are going to flood in the bottom part of the Santa, and then you're going to flood in his hat. Next, I'm going to fill in the Santa's face, and I actually made a little bit lighter icing to go in Santa's face. You can do that by taking just a little bit of that brown icing that you made, the darker brown, and add that to some white icing. But the great thing about the sugar art True Brown is you can make whatever shade you want to by just manipulating the amount of color that you put in the icing. But like I said, I just wanted a little bit lighter of a shade because I wanted to make sure that his face features really showed up well. So I just took some white and I added a little bit of the dark brown icing and created this very light shade. Now let's finish up our cute little Santa. What we're going to do next is we're going to take our red piping icing and we are going to fill in his hands. Now you'll notice that I use the piping icing for this little area because I do not want this to crater. In small icing areas, it is really easy for the icing to crater. I don't want that to happen. So you can either use a little bit of a thinner flood, or you can also put your piping icing down and then put your flood on top of it, because it's really easy for little small areas to crater. Now, you'll see me kind of manipulate the icing with my scribe. That's because I'm using piping icing and it's a little bit thicker. I might have some peaks and I'm just going to touch them with my scribe very easily and they'll usually sink right down into the icing. Now, if your flood is thick, it's no big deal. They can just be textured mittens. So now I am going to go with my white flood icing and you will see me create the beard and the other white areas of my cookie. Now here I'm using a tip number 1.5. I wanted to show you that if you do not like using tipless bags, this is an awesome tip. It's the only tip that I ever use when writing. It's called a 1.5 super tube, which means that it doesn't have a seam, so it creates a really nice round stream of icing. And this tip is made by PME. I think they're the only ones who make a 1.5 tip. So I'm just going around with my piping icing and I am filling in where his beard would be. This is very similar to what we did with the Christmas tree. Now this piping icing is a little bit thinner, so you will see me fill in the beard using the same icing, but you can use your flooding icing if you feel more comfortable about doing that. Or if you want your beard to have a lot of texture, you can use your piping icing. It's just whatever you prefer. Next, we are going to do the fluffy part of Santa's face. I'm going to use my thicker icing to do this to add some more texture to my cookie. But before I did that, I forgot. You can make a little nose out of a royal icing transfer, which means you do the icing down on a piece of parchment paper, just in a little dot, and then you allow it to dry overnight. That's what I like to do. It saves a lot of time. You can actually do that with flooding icing. Just make a little dot, put it down, let it dry overnight. You can make a whole bunch of them and then they will last forever. That's what I did on this cookie. If you don't want to do that, of course, you can use your same piping icing that you use to go around the face and you can create your little nose. But I like using royal icing transfers whenever I can. It's a real time saving. Now, once I'm done and this cookie has dried overnight, I can use my Tweets black marker. It's my favorite one to create the face. Next, we're going to do our reindeer cookie. And again, we're going to use the red marker to draw out where the different areas of icing would be. And I'm doing this by just looking at my clip art. Next, I'm going to take my brown piping icing and I'm going around all the areas that are going to be brown. And again, I'm just looking at the clip art to determine where that needs to happen. Now, right after I finish outlining my little reindeer, I'm going to go in with my darker brown flood, and I have a very small tip cut out because of that little skinny area by his nose. So I'm just going to flood this all in brown. I'm going to do his head, and then I'm going to do his body. Now, once I'm done flooding in the body and my head has crusted over, probably about 10 minutes or so, I can go in and I can do the ear. But before I do the ear, I'm going to do the antler because I want the antler to look like it's behind the ear a little bit. So I'm actually doing this with piping icing since it's such a small little area. And then I can use my scribe to move that icing around where I want it to be and to push down any little peaks. Now I can go ahead and I can do my tail, and I'm doing this with piping icing on the bottom, and then I add a little flood on the top. I want it to be nice and full, but I don't want it to crater. That's why I did the piping icing on the bottom. Next, I'm going to go around the nose with my lighter brown piping icing, And then I'm going to fill in the face. Once my face is filled in, I can go ahead and take my green piping icing and go around where the scarf is. Now you'll notice I put a little bit of piping icing in that area because again, I don't want it to crater. And I'm going to put my flood right on top. Now I'm going to allow a little bit of dry time in between when I do this scarf because I want you to be able to see the different sections. But you could also do it just as one piece and I think it would be super cute. So I've let that dry about 10 to 15 minutes. Again, I'm putting in the piping icing and then over top I'm going to put the flooding icing. And see how you can tell the two little sections? That's because of the dry time. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to fill in the ear. I waited just a little bit because I wanted the antler to have a little bit of time to dry. Now I definitely use piping icing here because it's such a little small area. Then I'm going to fill in the center of the ear with the lighter brown color. I use flooding icing for that. Next, I'm going to fill in the bottom of the belly. I'm putting piping icing at the bottom, and then I'm going to fill it in with the flooding icing. And while I'm doing this, the scarf area has had a little bit of time to dry. So that way, when I do the rest of the scarf, again, it's going to look like there are different sections. So I'm filling that in with the green flood icing. And I'm going to use my scribe to just wiggle it around. You'll notice that I don't spread the icing with my scribe. I just wiggle around the flood to get it where I want it to go. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of black. Now this is 20-second icing, meaning it's a little bit thicker than a regular flood icing and a little bit thinner of a piping icing. Next, I'm going to take my white piping icing because we're going over top of an icing that's already pretty dry. And I'm just squeezing out a little dot. Now, after this cookie has dried overnight, I'm going to add a little eye using that same Tweets skinny black marker. And then this cookie will be done. And on to the minis. Okay, so the minis are supposed to look like little pieces of gingerbread, little gingerbread cookies. So I love this one. This looks like an old-fashioned cookie that my mom and I would make whenever I was little. So you're just going to take your lighter brown color, it's sort of gingerbread colored, and you are going to go around the edge of your cookie with your piping icing. And then you are just going to fill it in with the same color flood. After you let the cookie crust over, probably about 15-20 minutes, you're going to take your white piping icing and you are just going to go around making sort of a design on top, like the outline of the star. And then you're going to take that same icing and do some dots in the center. And this cookie is done. I love this cookie. It's so simple, but I think so cute. And again, you're doing this with white piping icing. Now, let's do our little gingerbread man. Now, I first start to do his hand, and then I realize that that is not a good idea. So, to make this easier, I am just going to go around, you will see, the body of my gingerbread man with my piping icing. I was afraid I would mess up the hand if I did that first. So I'm going to go around the edge and then I'm going to fill this in with my flood icing. Then I'm going to let this crust over for about 10 minutes or so. But you could do this all in one step. You don't have to do these little extra steps if you don't want to. I just wanted there to be a little bit of a difference between the body and the arms. So that dried for about, I don't know, 15 minutes. And then I'm going to use my piping icing and I'm drawing his little arms or flooding in or filling in his little arms. I like the difference between the arms and the body, but like I said, you could just do this all with piping around the whole thing and then filling it in with flood. Sometimes I make unnecessary work for myself. I need to remember it's just a cookie. It's just a cookie. Next, I'm going to use my piping icing and I'm going to go around the outline of the head. And then I'm going to fill it in. Now you can tell a difference between where the head stops and the body starts because I let the body crust over. That dry time makes a difference. I'm going to fill this in. Or move my scribe around to make sure all the areas are filled in. Touch that little dot. See how it just sinks back in? Next, I'm going to take my dark brown piping icing and I'm just going to squeeze out some little dots. And when I do this, I keep my bag still and I just squeeze and the dots will continue to get a little bit bigger. I do this with my piping icing because it's a little, the dot will keep its shape better. Now I need to add the icing hair to my gingerbread. So I'm just doing that same squiggly pattern that we've done several times, and I'm going to create the icing head. So I did that with piping icing. Now I'm going to fill it in with flooding icing. Now I'm going to let this gingerbread man dry overnight. Then I'm going to take my red marker and I'm going to decorate the bottom of his body. And then I'm going to take my white piping icing and I'm going to do a little squiggle over top of that. So I did around the bottom and then I did around his little arms. But you have to make sure that the cookie's good and dry before you do that. Isn't he cute? So, do you see how I used the white? And then again, I drew on the little eyes. Next, we are going to make our gnome. So I'm drawing where the hat would end. And I'm making this gnome's beard very colorful. Or not colorful, but I'm using all the different brown shades that I used in other cookies. And this is all done with piping icing. So we're going to fill in our gnome with flooding icing after we've piped around the edge. And then we're going to allow it to dry for about 15 minutes. And then we're going to use all of the different colors icing that we have with piping. And we're going to draw lines down to make our little gnome's beard. Then we're going to take our white piping icing. After we do the bottom part of the beard again, I like to add a little bit of white. I think it's fun to have the brightness of the white against the other brown colors. Then we are going to fill in we're going to pipe around the edge of our hat, our little gnome's hat, and then we're going to fill it in with white. And then I'm going to use my red marker to decorate this hat. So after I fill it in, I'm actually going to allow it to dry overnight. And then I can go over top of it with the marker and I can draw designs on it. And that is a lot of fun, especially if you have kids. Let them do that. They'll love it. So you'll see I have a little clog in there, so I keep having to clean it off. That happens if you let your icing sit. You can just clean it off with a wet paper towel. I'm going around the edge and then I'm going to fill it and then I'm going to allow it to dry. And then after I draw on it, you will notice I put a little nose on my gnome. I made the nose using that same royal icing transfer technique where you just drop the icing onto a little piece of parchment paper and let it dry overnight. Again, I make a lot of these noses ahead of time during the holiday season because they're perfect on characters. And then after you add the nose and do your drawing and add the red to the top, this gnome is done. Now that we've done our cute minis, let's do our last cookie, which is our stocking. So first we're going to take our red marker, and you're just going to create a line where the toe would be and where the heel. This will allow you to place down your white piping icing. So you're just going to pipe along that line, and you're going to make an area to put your white flood icing. So after you pipe this area, you're going to fill it with white flood, and then you're going to do the same thing to the toe area. Then you're going to let this white dry for about 30 minutes before you fill the area with red. This just helps with the color bleeding, because sometimes you can have color bleeding between red and white. But if you allow the areas to dry a little bit, you won't have to worry about that as much. So after you fill your area and let it dry a little bit, you're going to take your red piping icing and you're just going to go around the edge of where the stocking will be. And then you're going to do the same thing that you did a minute ago. You're going to take your red flood icing and you're going to fill in that area going from the outside in. And again, make sure that when you fill with the flood that you make it good and full. Then you're going to allow your cookie to dry for another 30 minutes or so before you take your white piping icing and you fill in the top. Now the reason you're using your white piping icing here is you want it to be good and full and fluffy. Now, next we're going to use a special punch that I got from Amazon. I will link it in the notes or the comments. And next I'm going to take this and I'm going to take edible wafer paper and I'm just going to punch out little snowflakes. This sure is a lot easier than trying to do a snowflake with royal icing. Next I'm going to turn it over, and do you see how it makes those perfect little edible snowflakes? So once I have these, I'm just going to take a little bit of royal icing, just a little bitty drop, and I'm going to put the snowflake right on top of the stocking. You want to just use a little bit of royal icing, you barely need any. And our last cookie is done. So I hope you've enjoyed this set. And have a Merry, Merry Christmas. Does it smell like cake down here? He had to go to work. He was pretty bummed.